We'd like to thank you for joining us today for this very special webinar, talking about a very timely subject, guns and schools in the state of Georgia. We invite you during the presentation, if you would, if you have questions, to use the question facility that's built into the GoToWebinar. And we will have ample time. We want this to be an interchange so that any of the questions you might have will be able to be answered. We'd like to also invite you to become our friend on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. You can become our friend at Firestorm Solutions on Facebook. There is a hashtag for the session. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product provided must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, please do not interpret our comments or the content of this webinar as legal advice or legal opinion. We're so pleased to have the Georgia Independent Schools Association as our co-sponsor of this Crisis Coach webinar series. Today, guns and schools, mixed messages. We invite you also to go to Firestorm.com, where you can watch past webinars in this series. You can also register for future webinars, download white papers, download our book, all kinds of interesting things on our Firestorm.com site. The Crisis Coach webinar series is underwritten by the Georgia Independent School Association, and we're pleased to have as our moderator today Jeff Jackson, the president of Georgia Independent School Association. Jeff, over to you, please.
Jeff may be on mute there, it sounds like.
Yes, Jeff, hit the unmute.
Well, it looks like technical difficulties have come in. This is Jim Satterfield. I wanted to also recognize that we have many RenWeb schools today on the webinar. RenWeb shared the topic today because it's vital to schools across the country, not just here in the state of Georgia. And Jeff Jackson and the Georgia Independent School Association was gracious enough to allow that message to be shared across schools in multiple states, not just for their membership here in the state of Georgia. The Georgia Independent School Association plays a critical role in helping schools follow standards and best practices in every area, and has coming up some Crisis Coach workshops in September, one in Atlanta, the other in the Macon area, and that's toward the middle of September, and they'll be sending out an announcement for that, and then the fall meeting coming up in November. So there's a great many things happening at the Georgia Association of Independent Schools, and we look forward to sharing that in some today. By the way, I want to underscore something that Bill said. The toolbar to the right is a great opportunity as you have questions about what does this mean, or how does this apply, or particular situations at your school. If you'll type those in, Bill, who's our Vice President of Operations, will be monitoring that closely, and we'll have a couple of points in the webinar where we can stop and address those specific questions. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm president and one of the co-founders of Firestorm, and glad to be with you today. We also have Harry Rulin, who's our CEO and another of the co-founders with us. And Harry has been directly involved with many of the episodes that have occurred in our schools where guns became involved, and unfortunately in those situations with tragic results. And we will share some of those insights and what you need to do and what you need to think about as we go forward. So you're going to get a lot of insight as well as an update of what's going on. As we always do in these webinars, we talk about things that are in the news and things that you should be aware of in your schools. And you should have seen over the last day the events out of California where another planned attack by students on a school was fortunately identified and stopped before it could actually take place, and the savings were tremendous for that school as compared to dealing with multiple students with guns and bombs and having looked at that. But clearly the implication is quite severe as we all watch what's going on in Missouri with the activities there and the disruptions in schools because of the civil unrest. It shows that there are many factors that we need to address. It's not that all of these crises are unbelievable. They just become unthinkable. And they're unthinkable until it happens to you in your school in that area. One other observation that you need to be aware of as we move into the fall area, BioRadar, an organization who monitors communicable illness, has forecast that the swine flu will return at pandemic levels again this fall. So this is a good opportunity for you to review your plans as we carry forward. So today we want to go into this topic a little bit more, and it's part of the series in terms of simplifying school preparedness. There are a great many threats behind our students and young people in our schools that need to be addressed, and Firestorm works with you to help you prepare your school and your students to address it. So in thinking about guns, some of the thoughts today, we want to provide you an update of the new Georgia gun laws. The Council for the Georgia Independent School Association has done an analysis. I think that's gone out to everyone. We're going to go through that first and make sure you understand what these two laws mean. And if you're in another state, it's important to be aware of this because there is or will be similar legislation in your state, and here's an opportunity for you to become prepared and focus on those issues. We also then want to identify some critical decisions and some actions that you need to do now. Now that this has occurred, what's next? Where do we want to go? And we are today going to try to make this as interactive as possible and address questions. In fact, I can see that a question has already come in on the side. So that's our mission today. And if we could ultimately stop that gun from reaching that backpack and being pulled out at your school, that's a worthy objective for all of us to talk about. As we start that, we said we'd focus on the new Georgia gun laws. These went into effect July 1 of this year. They certainly are issues that will impact your campus starting now with the students that are currently there. There are two laws in particular, House Bill 826 and House Bill 60. And you see the links here, and if you would like a copy of this slide deck, just let us know and request that, and we will get that out to you. And because we will potentially have more questions than we can answer in the session today, I'm going to ask one of the Firestorm principals to reach out to everyone who attended today's webinar because of the criticality to answer questions and see how we can help and facilitate. So our focus today is around this legislation and what's driving our schools as we come together. Now, Pat McGee, who is the legal counsel for the Georgia Independent School Association, has read and reviewed these laws in depth. And I want to highlight, because it's in a different color and it's underlined at the top of this, one of the key recommendations is you need to carry back to your school that you need to have your specific questions about what does that mean for us right here in my school, working with your school's attorney. And that's going to be an important one to render that, and we'll give you kind of a checklist of things that you need to do in just a few minutes. But our goal first is to go through these two new laws. Now, Pat shared that the Act doesn't significantly change the existing weapon laws for school, except, and you'll look at that word, anytime you see the word except, and then obviously we want to bring it to your attention, that allows schools to authorize employees to carry weapons on campus. And that has a whole significant impact for you and your schools, and we'll discuss that in more detail. If you aren't going to allow employees to carry guns on campus, these two laws mean that you don't have to take any specific steps. But I think if you want to make your school safer and more prepared, there are specific steps that we'll discuss in a few moments. Let's go a little bit deeper under the covers here. The laws are long. They're 30 pages. When you look at legislation, whether it's state or federal, it's very complex, In some cases, legislation gets passed without everyone not reading every sentence or understanding every implication. Here's a warning, and this is the first of several that you're going to hear today. They are very specific in expanding the definition of what a weapon is, and it goes beyond firearms. And so when you think about that, this involves knives and other things that could be in your school, and who has authorization to have them, and where can they have them as it comes together. So that's a change, and this goes into a concept that we're going to talk a lot about and have talked about in the past, and that's unintended consequences that would be associated with it. So are guns allowed? With specific exceptions, they're not permitted on independent school campuses, at functions, or school buses or other transportation there. And you look here, here's an example of weapon being defined as any knife more than 2 inches long. Now, this insight was that Pat provided us, and that's why you see the quote marks there. So we wanted to be very specific in bringing this to your attention. Now, as we move from there, what are these exceptions, if they're exceptions? First of all, you'll see the list starting here, and it will continue on the next page. And so you can use it in the classroom work if you're trying to talk about it and using the gun as an illustrative area, and it was authorized by the teacher to be there. Bat sticks and sports equipment are generally not considered weapons. Participants in organized shooting events, many of the schools have shooting clubs or gun clubs and compete actively in there, so those can remain. If you have an ROTC program and it's involved in military training, if you're doing any law enforcement training, and then you see the police listed there in item 6. And then look at item 7. A person who's licensed to carry firearms, first statement, licensed to carry firearms, who carries a student to or picks up a student from a school function, or from a bus or other transportation furnished by the school. Now, I highlighted it in yellow and added to Pat's summary, when the weapon is kept in a vehicle. So we're not telling a parent that they can carry that gun on the school property strapped to their side, walking up the door to get their student. They can walk up and get their student. The gun needs to remain in the car. But the fact that they have a gun in the car is not a violation under that, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. Obviously, here's the rest of the 17, and you'll see defense contractors, the Attorney General, police, judges, clerks, and now here's item 16. This is a new addition that the law has expanded. Teachers and other personnel otherwise authorized to possess or carry weapons, in other words, they have to be licensed by the state that they're in, provided the weapons are locked in the vehicle. So they can have the weapon, but they cannot bring it into the school in this area. And the last is constables. So those are the exceptions associated with it. Now, a modified of this exception, as we referenced on the first list of exceptions, is that you can authorize a teacher to bring the weapon into the school. Yeah, but notice the second line here that Pat brings to our attention. The authorization must be in writing and specify the weapon or weapons permitted. So it's not enough to have a written authorization to say you can bring that gun, you can bring a gun, a pistol, or a rifle into it. You have to say a specific gun, a specific one, and they can bring that one, or if there's more than one, you have to identify those two. Since the campus, school, and places are already authorized, if you have a security officer at your school, it applies designed to teachers and administrators to carry the weapons on campus. Again, I yellow highlighted and underlined here to make sure that we understand there. So if you're not going to do that, you really don't have to take any actions under these two laws. If you are going to have a teacher or an administrator bring a gun onto campus, then that is an issue where you need to do it in writing, specify the specific weapon, and coordinate with it. We're going to talk around some of the implications of this and what you need to do next in just a few moments. But we wanted to make sure that everybody was familiar with the specific aspects of these new laws as they come together. Now, you can exclude a person under the laws from coming into your school if they're in possession of a weapon, except for those that you've authorized to do it or the list of exceptions there. Now, I'd like to bring to your attention the second sentence or paragraph there on the screen, and it's one that Pat called out specifically. A school should take care in adopting policies that establish a broad prohibition of weapons on campus, since such a prohibition may have the unintended consequence of excluding such things as dissection knives, baseball bats, shotguns for sport equipment, and weapons for campus police and security. So as Pat pointed out on the very first slide when we were talking about the laws, this is a reason why you need to review it with your board and have your outside counsel help you in these areas, because in many of these situations we continually see the unintended consequences. And so when we think about designing plans and putting programs in place, we have to understand what the impacts of those decisions are and the consequences there. So I copied the first page that Pat had shared with us again here as a summary as we move away from the laws and attach where we go from here. So Bill, I'm going to take a quick breath and ask, are there specific questions about the law as opposed to the implications of what we need to do next that have come up that we could address? So yes. Bill, is there any that would apply under that?
We've got a question here about, does this mean Christian schools are exempt from the legally carrying weapons? And the person says, I thought that independent schools are part of the exemption.
No, this was particularly designed to relate to independent schools and the laws in the state of Georgia, as Pat outlined from here. And again, that's an aspect, if you've got a specific question as it relates to your individual schools. And when we talk about independent schools, we are including all religious schools under that statement. So work with your legal counsel directly, or when we follow up after the call, you can ask more details around that. As we move forward, now we're going to focus on, now if that's in case, what do we do now? As always, you've seen us talk about a predict, plan, perform process. And understanding the implications here, understanding the vulnerabilities and threats, their impacts, another word for impacts or consequences, how we monitor and triggers. Associated with that, triggers tell us when we need to do something, putting your plans in place and to perform. So what do we do now and what do we say? And this is where I think we'll have a discussion with Harry and talk a little bit more about it. And so this is kind of an action plan that we would recommend based upon the new laws and the new requirements here that you should start to do. First, confer with your school's legal counsel. You should schedule a board discussion where the board reviews the laws, has the discussion, the benefit of counsel to provide specific area and training. Establish a school approach. How is your school going to approach the issue of guns at school, and how are you going to deal with it? Then once you clearly have that discussion, then you need to document that approach. That may require you to implement actions and training. Is that signage requirements that you would do? Is it specific controls? Is it training that you want to have? If you're going to allow someone to have a gun in school, what training have they had? Not only the firearms training, but dealing with events like an active shooter and coming together, and there are certainly some unintended consequences around that, and we'll talk about it in a moment. Once you've done that, then you would communicate the policy to the teachers, the parents, and the students. You want to conduct a tabletop exercise with the school leadership just to say, if this happens, what are we going to do? If we find a student with a gun, if we find these other activities, what are the steps that we're going to take? How are we going to monitor? And an exercise is always the best way to start to figure out where the difficulties come in. Now then, once that's all been in place, you're going to have to monitor the actions that occur. And if someone hits one of those triggers, they bring a gun or something else occurs, then you're going to need to act as needed. That can include exclusion. It can include other actions that would come together. Then you identify. We strongly recommend that you start to establish a behavioral threat risk assessment program at your school, because you want to identify and monitor behaviors of concerns. Are there students and staff who potentially pose a risk to themselves or others? And when it's just a warning sign, before it comes to behavior that could impact on others or physical violence or even death, we want to intervene at the lowest level possible. You've got to review all incidents after they've occurred so that you understand what are the implications on it. And the monitoring of social media becomes a critical element in this. What's being said today on social media will be happening tomorrow in your school. And it is the intelligence tool that will help you identify where action is needed. And we also encourage you to inform and coordinate with your local police. Let them know what your policy is. And in particular, if you have approved certain individuals to have guns on school, that the police understand that so we don't have an event. So Harry, we've given a lot of information here, and I would like you to share some of your thoughts and insights on guns in schools, and in particular share a conversation that you had with a principal who was, quote, packing at the school. Harry?
Well, Jim, I'd be happy to. And I've been involved in so many situations now with guns in schools, some with very unfortunate and very difficult outcomes, and some that have gone better. But the story that you're referring to is an interesting one. We were doing an analysis of a school in terms of their safety and security protocols, what their planning looked like, a gap analysis of their existing plans for how they were going to deal with armed intruders in the school. And the principal revealed to me at that time that he carried a firearm in the school. And I said to him, well, can you show me the plan that how you're involved in the process and what your communications look like with your staff and with the local police department? And he got a very blank look on his face. And so I said, well, obviously, if you're carrying a gun in the school, you're part of the overall protection plan for the school. Tell me what it is that you're going to do. And he said, well, if I hear gunfire or if I hear that there's someone in the school with a gun, I'm going to go out and confront them. And they said, well, okay, do the police know that you're carrying a gun? And he said, no. I said, do you have some specific article of clothing, a vest, a jacket, that identifies you as a member of the staff? He said, no. And he was starting to get a little irritated with me with the line of questioning that I was giving him. And then I explained to him that without a plan that's been fully tested, that's fully documented, that the police actually have participated in, when they arrive at the school, the order that the school that the police have in place, 50 statewide, is that when they respond to a school incident, anyone with a gun is deemed to be a perpetrator. So unless he has some way of identifying himself as a member of the school community, the likelihood is that he will be shot by the police as well as anyone else in the school carrying a gun. One of the big changes also now in terms of the police response to armed intruder incidents in schools is that since Columbine, they've developed a new strategy, which is basically first officer on site goes in. So they no longer wait for backup. They go in and try to neutralize the perpetrator as quickly as they can. And that creates even more risk, obviously, for a school who has armed teachers or administrators where that has not been thoroughly communicated with the police. Because obviously, if you're a lone officer going into a school, the likelihood that you're going to have the time or the presence of mind to try and determine who is who is that much less. So that I think that was an eye-opening discussion for that particular school, and hopefully they'll never have an incident. But if they do, I think it's probably either saved a life or saved a lot of grief. So that was that particular incident.
Well, thanks, Harry, for sharing that, and I think it's a good aspect. When we're very fortunate in America that we have people that will run toward the gunfire. Our police are placed in an extremely difficult position, and when they have a report of an active shooter or an armed intruder in a school, and they're running there, and they suddenly see someone with a gun, they have to make a decision in fractions of a second of what to do next. And in that period of time, the concept of unintended consequence that Pat raised earlier with his description would be an immediate outcome, as Harry, I think, described very effectively here. Harry, when you look at this schedule of activities, is there any that you would care to comment on or to clarify a little further?
I'm sorry, Jim, I had you on mute for a second. The schedule of activities, you mean the things that you've got up on the screen currently?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think, this one page could be a webinar unto itself. The whole concept of guns in schools and the idea of arming teachers or staff or not allowing guns in schools is just such a huge topic. You talk about scheduling a board discussion. If you're going to have a board discussion, one of the things I would say is you should have that board discussion first in some type of an executive session if possible, because when you open this subject up to the general public, which very often are present at board discussions, even in a private school environment, if the board allows parents, community members, anyone else to participate, that can get to be a very contentious type of discussion. But I think you pointed out earlier, Jim, that we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. I think it's very important to do your predictive work here. Have all of those discussions, have as much of it all in line, and have developed your plan, which I guess then goes down to the next item there, the establish the school approach. I mean, that whole planning piece and developing it in detail before you then go and try and roll it out in front of your community, your parents, your public, whomever it might be, is going to be so important. And of course, do the test exercises so that you do catch issues like the one I just raised a minute ago. Do you have appropriate clothing, appropriate vests, jackets, whatever it might be, for your staff or anyone else who are not going to be in lockdown? So obviously, if you lock down your school because you have an armed intruder, but you're going to allow certain people to rove, those roving teams definitely need to have the appropriate presentation so that they don't become part of the problem. And all of that goes to the overall process. You can't just say, we're going to have firearms in our school. We're going to allow Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones, because they have concealed carry permits, to carry their firearms in our school. It requires so much more thought than that, because what type of holsters are they using? For example, the police can't use holsters that it's very difficult for anyone other than the person wearing it to actually remove the firearm from the holster. Is the teacher going to keep the gun on them full time when they're in the school, or are they going to be allowed to lock it in their desk, for example? There's what type of ammunition are they carrying in their firearm? How many times a year are they going to be required to qualify at the range? Are they going to be required to go through continuing education on the effects of a firefight? I mean, there's just so many issues that have to be dealt with if you're going to go down this road, and it really requires comprehensive, detailed planning from people who understand what all of the issues are. So, like I said, I could talk on this one page on and on, because each one of these steps is a very detailed step that has to happen.
So we've left this up for a while so that you could have a chance just to jot down the thoughts here as we're coming together. But recognizing that even a vest that says teacher or principal on it isn't 100% foolproof, because that vest could be stolen. And knowing what's going on, it makes a significant difference in these areas. And we can't emphasize enough that at the point when it occurs, the adrenaline, the emotion, all of those areas are functioning at the highest possible speed simultaneously, and the unintended consequences can be grave for everyone in concern. So we're going to stop here for a second. And Bill, are there other questions or more questions related to any of the aspects about it? Because we're going to focus, once we move from this slide, on how to do some things that may help and alleviate that. And we've got about 15 minutes left in our webinar for today. Right. So Bill, questions that you want to bring?
Well, we have a person who's saying that at Sandy Hook, the police officer did not go in by himself, and questioning whether there's been a change or whether they acted incorrectly.
Well, obviously you have to make decisions in those moments. So I think, Harry, you were about to speak, so I'll let you go forward first.
Yeah, no, the protocol that's been established and developed since Columbine, and just so you know, there's a law enforcement briefing that takes place here in Colorado every year now since the Columbine shootings, and they've developed a model approach to how they recommend police departments deal with any armed intruder type of situation. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean that based on individual circumstances, a police officer is always going to do exactly what that says. There could always be reasons why they do or they don't. Similarly, the training that any individual department receives could be different across the country. So we were not involved in Sandy Hook, so I'm not directly familiar with what the tactical response there was, but I can tell you that pretty much, as I understand it, nationwide, the protocol is that first officer on scene goes in. But again, I'm not familiar specifically with the officer that was first on scene at Sandy Hook, nor what they did.
Okay. The conversation that we're having is a perfect example of why this needs to be a board decision, why you need to coordinate with your local police department, and you need to pull this together as a unified approach. Firestorm aggregates standards and best practices across all schools and, in fact, across all industries as we come together. So once your plan is established here, you need to coordinate with your local police, whether that's a sheriff or a police department, so that you know exactly what they're going to do and they know exactly what you're going to do. I would recommend that on a weekend you ask them to hold a drill at your school so that they become familiar with the layout of your campus, your buildings, and your protocol, so that when seconds really matter, the optimum will happen. Now, I don't want to walk too far away from that statement, when something happens in seconds. We are a fairly large employer of retired Secret Service agents, and they will tell you that if they have to draw their gun, their plan didn't work. And they will also say that when seconds really matter, the police will be there in minutes. So that's why it's so critical that your school have a program that follows the national protocol of shelter in place, evacuation, lockdown, lockout, and to understand and use that common terminology so that your police department knows what your plans are and your teachers and your students do. We had a question before today's webinar from an individual who's attended over 20 of our webinars and talking about some particular and the angst decisions that are created and the angst that caused when these type of events happen and you have people that are in your care, custody, and control. And what does that mean to you to have to make these decisions? So, Bill, we can probably do one more question, and then we'll go through and try to cover the ending and still finish on time.
Question about how do you post the exceptions if someone is saying they want to be authorized to carry? Does that in writing have to be posted somewhere, or is that just an internal requirement?
Well, I think, first of all, we would want to coordinate with our local police to let them know that Mrs. Smith is going to have a gun at school. We certainly want to do that. We want to communicate it with our teachers and our staff and administrators within our school so that they're aware that this is what's being done. If we're going to do it, it's not going to be a secret. We're going to want people to understand that we're doing that. I also think you need to share it with your parents, because that may affect someone's decision about the school in areas. And as a general rule, every time we think about a crisis, that it comes as a surprise, and generally surprises are not good in this area. So you wouldn't want them to find out later about that. Harry wanted to add a comment. Harry?
Yeah, let me just jump in there for 1 second. When you say share it with parents, I think what we would share with parents is the policy that the school is allowing certain teachers or administrators to carry firearms. We would never identify to anyone other than law enforcement specifically who is carrying, because obviously most school events, most situations like you saw just now in California, there's a lot of planning that these kids put into these attacks. If they know who the individuals are that are carrying, they will either neutralize those people first, or they may actually make as part of the plan. They know that they don't need to get a gun into the school. They just need to figure out how to get Mrs. Smith's gun away. So, you know, you need to be very careful. Again, it requires so much thought process before you ever go down this road. And I will also point out to you that statistically, even trained police officers who qualify at least twice a year at the range, who go through continuous psychological training about how to deal with a firefight, their effectiveness in terms of hitting their intended target in an actual firefight, the New York City Police Department conducted a very long-term study and found that only about 18% of the bullets hit their intended target. Think about that in a school environment. Where do the other 82% of the bullets go? So I only say that, you know, I've been a member of the NRA since I was 21 years old, and I'm 50 now. I am very much a supporter of gun ownership, and I have no problem with guns, but I will tell you this. If a school is thinking about guns in school, you need to have an extraordinarily detailed plan and planning process. There needs to be training, education. There needs to be continuous updating of the plan. Jim's point about bringing the police department in and doing test and mock exercises is an excellent one. I mean, this is a huge step for any school in terms of the change to their security protocol, and it needs to be extraordinarily well documented and thought through.
As all planning does, and I think that's a great point. This law has just now elevated the urgency for your board. This is a governance issue to become involved. So how do you do it? You establish a framework with overarching policies and procedures, and we would encourage you to think about it from a predict, plan, perform process. And all the little gray boxes you see are steps that you need to take. Do a gap analysis on your plan. How are you going to handle specific threat assessments and a vulnerability analysis of the risk that your school faces? And then you see a lot of the things that you need specific plans for listed there. Most of the schools that we have had a chance to have a conversation have no reunification plan. How do we get students and parents back together after an event has occurred, a fire or an active shooting? You're not going to tell one parent in front of another that their child has been injured or died. How you identify that and separate them and control. The details here become absolutely critical. And then after you have the plans in place, then you've got to execute across all of the perform areas. And training and exercising become a key aspect with that, along with the monitoring. Doing background checks is an issue that many of you do, but some of you are going with the low bidder, and I'm concerned about the gaps there. You need to think about who established your background check strategy, who approved the background check strategy. Is it a waste of time or is it critical? What's your hit rate on the background checks that you're doing? SHRM, which is the Society of HR Managers across the country, have found that over 30% of the time a background check identifies a problem. If you're not getting that kind of a hit rate associated with your background checks, you are missing. When we think about fishing, I always say that the fishing is great, it's the catching that sometimes is not a good aspect for us to find. But at this point in time, it's what are you finding? we want you to follow standards and best practices in this area, doing annual background checks. Even if your state says, well, if you've done a fingerprint check, we'll give you an update, they're only giving you an update on convictions. And so anybody that's been arrested as opposed to convicted, you're not going to find that from just a paper background check. And the difference between a felony and a conviction, generally the paper background checks very clearly address convictions to felonies. They don't address misdemeanors. You have to go to the county courthouse in order to see that if it's not posted on a system. And over half of the counties in the United States don't automatically report it. Also imagine this, if you're not looking at misdemeanors, if you're not going to that, someone could have been arrested for a felony, plea bargained down to a misdemeanor, and you would not know it. And that would be a very difficult issue to deal with. So it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to background checks. And we'll do a webinar later this year just about that. Is it being used to screen? Is it being used to investigate? And there are two different levels that you have to perform. We don't want you ever to be in a position where it could have, would have, or should have come into play if someone says, well, it was public knowledge that this had occurred. Why didn't you know that in your school? Threats and risk are a key element that you need to be able to look at behaviors of concern. We want to prevent that gun from coming to school. You need to establish a behavioral threat risk assessment program within your school. Having a policy and plan, training people, having a team that can respond to it, and identify that. And when you have identified a student who's a potential risk to themselves or others, then you've got a casework responsibility to follow them for their entire school career. We've done some webinars on this subject. We'll continue to do them on that. If you don't have a behavioral threat risk assessment program in your school, and if you haven't had an independent review, that's an area that you should think about. The types of threats could be direct, indirect, veiled, or conditional. The direct threats where it's to a particular individual at a particular time, and it seems to be plausible and they have the ability to deal with it, are obviously the most critical. You need to establish a threat protocol within your school from low, medium to high, and there's specific actions that need to be taken at each one of these levels. Social media is now a significant change in the life of everyone. You can see students just sitting next to each other but texting messages back and forth. It becomes the intelligence tool within your school to know what's going on. So you would learn about these potential behavioral indicators via social media. It's the intelligence tool that your school needs to follow and use, because what's on social media today will be occurring in your school tomorrow. Just think about the stories today coming out of Pasadena. You'll see here just a couple of clips that we've lifted from the internet that's publicly available. We're not breaking into anybody's passwords or secured accounts that are out there. Guess who's going to bring a gun to school tomorrow? And it's pointing to themselves. And I apologize for the language here, but there's a picture here with a student with a gun in a classroom. Do you think we should bring a gun to school as a prank tomorrow? Here are great examples of intelligence in actual schools where that could be seen tomorrow. And this is not a public school only problem. It's a problem that happens in schools across the country. You need to be monitoring, and here are just some of the aspects that you need to be thinking about so that you get alerts. We focus on streams. Streams are made up of 10 phrases, and phrases are made up of up to 3 words. But gun in school is a good example of that in an area for you to think about as you come together. And this is more than a Google search. If you want to know more about that, when we follow up after the webinar, we can share it. So the next steps, these are the same ones that we listed earlier in the webinar for you to think about. I added there that specific questions should be referred to your school's attorney. I think Pat would really want us to stress that as we've talked about. If you want to know where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, the Georgia Independent School Association and RenWeb for their schools is underwriting the cost of you having an assessment of your school. Where are you relative to standards and best practices? And this could well be a tool that would help you, and it's available to you at no cost. Our thanks today to the Georgia Independent School Association for making this webinar available, and thanks to RenWeb for sharing it with all of their schools across the country. I think that this is an issue that's not going to go away, and our goal is for you to be discussing it in your board today instead of trying to explain on the news tomorrow why these events happen. So thanks to the Georgia Independent School Association. You can come to Firestorm.com to watch this webinar again, or to share it with others, or to watch other webinars that we've recorded. If you've got questions, contact us at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We will also try to reach out to answer all the questions that we couldn't do live today in the webinar individually with you, and we thank you for your time. We thank you for all that you're doing for our children every day in your schools. We responded to the death of an 8-year-old girl over the weekend. She was at a camp. She was healthy. Everything was fine. She became ill, had an event, went into cardiac arrest, became brain dead, and the parents had to make the decision about life support. We don't want a gun in your school to create that same situation for you to deal with. Have a great day. If you've got questions, we'll be in touch. Bill, thanks for coordination. Jeff, thanks for pulling this together, and to Pat for giving us all those insights on it. And Harry, thank you for sharing your experiences. Have a great day, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.